August 24th, 410 AD. In the middle of the night, the Salarian Gate of Rome swings open, and armed men pour into the sleeping city. For 800 years, no foreign enemy has set foot inside these walls. Rome is not just a city, it is the city, the center of the world, the capital of an empire so vast and so old that its people simply call it eternal. And now, by torchlight, the eternal city is burning. Across the Mediterranean, when the news arrives, people refuse to believe it. One writer puts it simply: the city that took the whole world has itself been taken. This is the story of how Rome fell, and it is nothing like the legend. To understand the shock, you have to understand what Rome was. At its height, the empire stretched from the reign of northern Britain to the deserts of Egypt, from the Atlantic coast to the rivers of Mesopotamia. A quarter of all humanity may have lived under its laws. Its legions had not lost a major war in centuries. Its roads, 50,000 miles of them, tied 3 continents into a single machine of trade, taxes, and power. Roman citizens genuinely believed their city was protected by the gods and destined to rule forever. For them, imagining the fall of Rome was like imagining the end of the world. And yet, inside this magnificent machine, the gears had already begun to grind. The trouble started long before any barbarian reached the gates. In the 3rd century, the empire nearly tore itself apart. In just 50 years, Rome went through more than 20 emperors, almost all of them murdered by their own soldiers or killed in civil wars. Plague swept through the provinces. The silver coinage was debased until money became nearly worthless, and inflation crushed ordinary families. The empire survived, barely, but it came out changed. It was now so huge and so unstable that one emperor could no longer hold it, and eventually it was split in two. A Western empire ruled from Italy, and a richer Eastern empire ruled from Constantinople. Remember that split. It decided who would live and who would die. Now about those barbarians. Forget the cartoon image of drooling savages in furs. The peoples beyond the Roman border, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, were farmers, warriors, and traders who had lived alongside Rome for generations. They bought Roman goods, learned Roman ways, and many of them dreamed not of destroying the empire, but of living inside it. Thousands of them already did, because Rome, short on manpower, had been hiring barbarian soldiers into its own army for decades. Entire Roman legions now spoke Gothic around their campfires. The wall between Roman and barbarian was already paper thin. It just needed something to punch through it. That something came riding out of the east. The Huns, nomadic horse archers from the Great Steppe, fast, ruthless, and unlike anything Europe had ever seen. In the 370s, they smashed into the lands of the Goths north of the Danube, and an entire world collapsed in a matter of years. Whole nations packed up and ran. In the year 376, something unprecedented happened on the Roman border. Tens of thousands of Gothic men, women, and children appeared on the banks of the Danube, not as an invading army, but as terrified refugees, begging to be let in. The Eastern Emperor said yes. It may have been the single most fateful decision in Roman history. The refugees were let in, and then they were betrayed. Corrupt Roman officials stole the food meant for them and sold it back at obscene prices. Starving Gothic families were forced to trade their children for dog meat. Pushed past breaking point, the Goths rose in revolt. And in 378, at a place called Adrianople, they met the Eastern Roman army in open battle. What followed was the worst Roman military disaster in centuries. 2/3 of the army was destroyed in a single afternoon, and the Emperor Valens himself was killed on the field, his body never found. The lesson tore through the ancient world like lightning. Roman legions could be beaten. The gods, it seemed, had stopped watching. And here is the uncomfortable truth about the empire's final century. Rome was no longer defended by Romans. Its citizens had long since stopped volunteering for the army, so the legions were filled with the very barbarians the empire feared, led increasingly by barbarian generals. The real power behind the Western throne was usually a soldier of Vandal or Gothic blood, while the emperors themselves became weak, sheltered figures, hiding in the marsh-protected city of Ravenna. Meanwhile, the tax system strangled the poor, the rich dodged everything, and the bureaucracy rotted from the inside. The barbarians did not break into a fortress. They walked into a house whose walls were already crumbling, which brings us back to that night in 410. The man who took Rome, Alaric the Goth, was no wild-eyed destroyer. He was a Roman-trained general who had fought for the empire and spent years asking for one thing: land and recognition for his people. Rome answered with broken promises and betrayal, so Alaric marched on the city and blockaded it until the Senate paid him off, then came back twice when the deals collapsed. When his patience finally died, his Goths entered the city and sacked it for 3 days. By the standards of the age, it was almost restrained, churches were spared, and the city was not burned to the ground. But the psychological wound was fatal. The eternal city had fallen, and every empire built on the idea of Roman invincibility felt the ground move. The next blow came from a people whose name is still an insult today: the Vandals. On a frozen New Year's Eve in 406, they had crossed the iced-over Rhine with a coalition of tribes and carved their way through Gaul and Spain. But their masterstroke came in 439, when under their brilliant, ruthless king, Genseric, they captured Carthage in Roman North Africa, the richest provinces of the West, the source of Rome's grain, and its tax money. At a stroke, the empire lost its breadbasket and its wallet. Worse, the Vandals built a war fleet and turned the Mediterranean, the Roman lake, into a hunting ground. In 455, they sailed to Rome itself and sacked it for 14 days, so thoroughly and so methodically that we still use their name for senseless destruction. Vandalism. And then there was Attila. In the 440s, the scattered Huns united under a single king who turned extortion into an art form, bleeding Constantinople for thousands of pounds of gold a year, and earning a nickname that says it all: the Scourge of God. In 451, he invaded the West with a massive army and was fought to a bloody standstill in Gaul by a desperate alliance no one thought possible: a Roman army and a Gothic army standing side by side. The next year, he ravaged Italy, and Rome was saved, according to legend, only when Pope Leo rode out to meet him face to face. A year later, Attila died suddenly on his own wedding night, and his empire shattered overnight. The Huns vanished from history almost as fast as they had appeared, but the storm they set in motion could no longer be stopped. By the 460s and 470s, the Western Empire was an empire mostly on paper. Britain had been abandoned decades earlier, left to fend for itself. Gaul was becoming the kingdom of the Franks, the land that would one day be called France. Spain belonged to the Visigoths. Africa was Vandal. What remained was Italy and scraps, ruled by a parade of throwaway emperors who came and went every year or two, installed and discarded by barbarian generals who held all the real power. The government was bankrupt. The legions of Italy were barbarian soldiers who simply wanted what soldiers had always wanted: land and pay. And the treasury could no longer afford either. The end, when it finally came, was almost absurdly quiet. In 476, the army of Italy mutinied and chose as its leader a barbarian officer named Odoacer. On the throne at that moment sat a boy of about 16, a puppet placed there by his own father. By a bitter joke of history, his name was Romulus Augustulus. Romulus, like the founder of Rome; Augustus, like its first emperor. The whole story of the city bracketed in the name of a frightened teenager. Odoacer marched on Ravenna, deposed the boy, and then did something remarkable. He did not bother to make himself emperor. He simply packed up the imperial regalia, the crown and the purple robes, and shipped them east to Constantinople with a message: the West no longer needs an emperor. After 1,200 years, the Roman state in the West ended not with a great battle, but with a resignation letter. But here is the twist the legend never tells you. For most people alive in 476, nothing changed. No city burned that year. The Senate still met. The aqueducts still ran. Odoacer ruled Italy much as the emperors had, using the same Roman officials, the same Roman laws. And the eastern half of the empire did not fall at all. It endured for another 1,000 years as what we now call the Byzantine Empire until 1453, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman cannon. Meanwhile, the barbarian kingdoms that replaced the West did not erase Rome. They imitated it. Their kings issued Roman-style laws in Latin, and the language of the conquerors dissolved into the language of the conquered, evolving into Italian, French, and Spanish. The empire died. Its ghost got up and kept walking. So why did Rome really fall? Historians have proposed more than 200 reasons, everything from lead poisoning in the water pipes to moral decay. And the honest answer is that there was no single killer. It was a pileup. Endless civil wars that burned through armies and money, a tax system that devoured its own people, plagues that emptied the countryside, a shifting climate that squeezed harvests and pushed whole peoples into motion. And on the borders, millions of desperate humans displaced by the Huns, knocking on the door of a state too corrupt and too divided to either integrate them or stop them. The East, facing many of the same threats with more money and stronger cities, survived just fine. Rome was not murdered by barbarians, it was worn down by 1,000 cuts, and most of them were self-inflicted. 15 centuries later, we are still telling this story and still arguing about it because the fall of Rome is history's greatest warning. Every empire since, from the Spanish to the British to the superpowers of today, has looked at Rome and asked the same nervous question. Are we next? But maybe the real lesson is quieter than that. Rome fell slowly, then all at once, not to a single enemy, but to its own weight, its own division, and its own refusal to believe that the end was even possible. The people who lived through it barely noticed it was happening. Only afterward, standing in the rubble of something that had seemed eternal, did the world understand what it had lost. Empires, it turns out, are mortal. All of them. By the 470s, the Western Empire existed mostly on paper. Britain had been abandoned decades earlier. Gaul was becoming the kingdom of the Franks, the future France. Spain belonged to the Visigoths, Africa to the Vandals. What remained was Italy, ruled by throwaway emperors installed and discarded by barbarian generals who held the real power. The end, when it came, was almost absurdly quiet. In 476, the army of Italy mutinied under a barbarian officer named Odoacer. On the throne sat a boy of about 16, and by a bitter joke of history, his name was Romulus Augustulus. Romulus like the founder of Rome, Augustus like its first emperor, the whole story of the city bracketed in the name of one frightened teenager. Odoacer deposed him, gently, even granting him a pension. And then he did something remarkable. He did not make himself emperor. He packed up the crown and the purple robes and shipped them east to Constantinople with a message. The West no longer needs an emperor. 1,200 years of Roman power in the West ended not with a battle, but with a resignation letter. But here is the twist the legend never tells you. For most people alive in 476, nothing changed. No city burned that year. The Senate still met. The aqueducts still ran. Odoacer ruled Italy much as the emperors had, using the same Roman officials and the same Roman laws. And the East did not fall at all. Behind the walls of Constantinople, the Roman Empire simply kept going for another 1,000 years as what we now call Byzantium, until 1453, when the city finally fell to Ottoman canon. Meanwhile, the barbarian kingdoms of the West did not erase Rome. They imitated it. Their kings issued Roman-style laws in Latin, and the language of the conquerors dissolved into the language of the conquered, evolving into Italian, French, and Spanish. The Church kept Rome's language, Rome's capital, and Rome's ambition of a universal empire, and simply transferred them to heaven. The empire died. Its ghost got up and kept walking. So why did Rome really fall? Historians have proposed more than 200 reasons, everything from lead pipes to moral decay, and the honest answer is that there was no single killer. It was a pileup. Endless civil wars that burned through armies and money, a tax system that devoured its own people, plague, a shifting climate, and on the borders, millions of desperate people set in motion by the Huns, knocking on the door of a state too divided to either integrate them or stop them. The East, facing the same threats with more money and better walls, survived just fine, which tells you the fall was never inevitable. Rome was not murdered by barbarians. It was worn down by 1,000 cuts, and most of them were self-inflicted. 15 centuries later, every superpower still looks at Rome and asks the same nervous question. Are we next? Because that is the real lesson of the Eternal City. It fell slowly, then all at once, to its own weight and its own refusal to believe the end was even possible. Empires, it turns out, are mortal.